Now, before we get too far into it, I would also, of course, like to thank our many partners who have helped make this event happen. That includes Horizon Ottawa, the Elizabeth Fry Society of Ottawa, Time Space, the Ottawa Coalition to End Violence Against Women, Wisdom to Action, and last but certainly not least, Time Space. If you were joining, I'm going to give it a couple seconds as folks are indeed still filtering in, but if you are participating or watching this evening, you are welcome to also join us on Twitter. We are using the hashtag #SaferCities. No spaces, no complexities in that hashtag. We're keeping it short and sweet for everyone with us today. And we are trying to keep today both impactful and also informal to center the diverse perspectives, lived experiences, and I would say overall brilliance of our many panelists, whom you will be hearing more from in just a few minutes. For those of you who do not know, there's a bit of context for why we are hosting this event this evening. This event was indeed organized by a set of Ottawa-based organizations, all of whom I mentioned a moment ago, and it was directly in response to a number of local incidences that have taken place over the past 8 months. One piece of that is that we have seen anti-trans groups and organizations putting up a very sustained campaign of transphobic stickers throughout our downtown core, in the Glebe of Ottawa, in the Byward Market, and in other spaces across the city. We have also seen anti-trans stickers that touched on and conveyed very violent and unpleasant messages popping up on the signs of one of our local candidates in the most recent federal election. That candidate was unwilling to cater to anti-trans bigots, and they responded with anti-trans stickers, as we would expect them to. We also saw an anti-trans protest taking place in Ottawa just a week ago. That being said, they could only get 14 folks out, so I think that gives us a little bit of hope for the fact that TERFs and other anti-trans groups, while they give the appearance of numbers, are often not as numerous as they may seem or as we might imagine them to be. More generally, over the past number of years, we have seen greater degrees of organizing against trans rights in this country. We have seen a conversion therapy bill in the House of Commons that was targeted by anti-trans groups, using debunked and I would say disinformation-based arguments of free speech, of criminalizing conversations, none of which were genuine issues within that conversation. In this most recent election, we saw a major or trying to be major political party that explicitly targeted the rights of trans people. The last piece of context is to share and to reaffirm that cities are not safe for many trans people, and not only for trans people, but for other members of our communities and other folks impacted by systemic violence and oppression. Our hope in this conversation tonight is to both talk through some of those issues, talk through some of the roots of hate and what we're seeing in terms of anti-trans and other hate-based organizing in this city, and to inform recommendations for our municipalities, our provinces, our national or federal government, as well as individuals in terms of how we combat anti-trans hate and create cities, communities, municipalities, and spaces that are genuinely supportive of trans people in all our brilliant diversity. In terms of some housekeeping for today, this panel is indeed being recorded, and so if you are not able to stay for the full session, there will be a YouTube link posted after. It is also being live streamed to the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity Facebook page, who is one of our primary partners in this event. Attendees do not currently have access to the chat, but you are able to message the hosts and our panelist team if you have any questions. So please do not hesitate to do so if any issues arise. Beyond that, if we have time for Q&A, and I can't guarantee that we will, but we will see, you should be able to submit your questions to the Q&A feature at the bottom bar of your screen. Throughout our time together, if any issues do take place, we do encourage you to message us and we will do our best to address them. And lastly, we of course want to make this space as inclusive, candid, casual, and impactful as possible. Please join us in bringing that spirit to our time together this evening. And now I have the phenomenal pleasure of introducing our panelists. We have Maëlys, Noah, Jade, and Jaime, a phenomenal set of Ottawa-based folks who've been doing tons of work on trans, 2S LGBTQ, and other progressive issues in our local communities, who are also connected to varying extents to national, provincial advocacy on our issues. I'm very excited to now, in a moment, give them a chance to introduce themselves, and our style, being candid, is going to be a little bit popcorn in nature. And so now I would like to invite a panelist, whoever would like to step in first, to introduce themselves, share their name, their pronoun, if they're here with an organization, what organization they might be a part of, and a little bit about themselves. Would anybody like to kick us off this evening? How about Jade? Would you like to go first?
I saw no one mute for a minute. I was like, yeah, I can go first. Kwe Dalawi Jade Peek, Dalawi Japuktuk Migmagi, Wabanaki, Nin Antagoetwich, Okalunu. Hi, folks. My name is Jade Peek. My pronouns are she and her. I mentioned in my language that I am African Nova Scotian and Mi'kmaq, and I'm also from originally Halifax, Nova Scotia, and I've been living in Ottawa for 3 years now. It feels like I just arrived here yesterday. I'm the Director of Advocacy and Community Care outside of Kindspace, and a little bit about myself is primarily I have been out for 10 years. And I came out when I was very young and you know, instantly became a homeless trans person in the streets of Halifax. As a background, I was a sex worker and often worked in Halifax and was put into different dangerous situations. And I was very lucky at the time, because there was not resources, to actually have grassroots community folks who were older, had better experiences than I do, and was able to help me sort of navigate through those experiences that I would have never been able to have. And if I didn't have that, then I wouldn't have been able to be involved with the type of work that I do now, or even the work that I did back then. One of the things that I was a part of was supporting and maintaining a trans house, which was predominantly folks who were able to sort of rent the space for everybody. And then we had extra rooms for homeless trans folks who needed a place to stay, or needed, you know, unemployed or not, whatnot, needing a place to go, because we recognized that there were a lot of housing issues, especially for me. I was lucky because I was in post-secondary at the time that I was homeless. So I was able to, you know, we were a 24-hour, so I studied art history and critical theory at NASCAD University, and it's also it's an arts institution. So they have 24-hour studios. So I was able to, you know, finally, when I got my access card, go in, sleep on the couch, go sleep in a bathroom. They finally put the gender neutral washroom up. So I was like, yes. And so I went in and was able to sort of like rest. But these were the types of things that, you know, as a young trans person, you know, I navigated it, and then slowly got involved with not only activism, but particularly community organizing. You know, it's one thing to advocate for things, but what do we do to actually, you know, either it be mutual aid, either it be create a space in our homes or in our hearts or in the spaces where we work, to not only be inclusive of trans folks, but actually, you know, begin to build those tables with trans folks in mind, as opposed to just slapping and saying we're trans friendly. Because, you know, we've seen these in services, and which we'll talk about today, where, you know, you can slap a trans friendly on it, but doesn't automatically mean that it's going to be accessible or you know, or helpful for folks. And so I've been very privileged to move to Ottawa and work at Kindspace, which is a 2S LGBT organization that is both a service center and a community space. For those of you who've been wondering, we're about to reopen fully in person. So please get ready for that. As even when we were, you know, when the pandemic hit, we definitely knew how hard it was for trans folks, specifically who were looking for resources, looking for support, and not being able to have that. And then, you know, we're not a crisis center, but oftentimes having to navigate through crisis and help what folks need, because we need to do it. And I think oftentimes, you know, a lot of the support is coming from individual community members. So I could go on forever and talk about myself, but these are the things that are on my mind today, a little bit about the stuff that I'm interested in. And again, I'm an EDI consultant, but a lot of the work that I do is within anti-racism, women and trans activism and community organizing. So these things are always in synthesis as they intersect with my identities. So yeah,
Thanks so much, Jade. Noah, maybe over to you, since we all did see you unmute for that moment ago.
I did. Hello, folks. My name is Noah. My pronouns are he and him. A bit about myself. So I am born and raised in Ottawa. And that's really important for me because that informs the work I do and that informs my presence today because the city is important to me. The folks in the city are important to me. A bit about what I do. I am the programs manager with the Enchante network. For folks who are not familiar with the Enchante network, it's a national network connecting to us LGBTQ organizations across the country. So we look to support and connect these organizations who are doing such life-affirming work. So my role is to create programming that assists organizations in our member networks to build their capacity to serve their communities, have the tools and the skills to be able to do the life-saving work that they do. I'm coming to this work being a previous frontline service provider. So my background is in social work. I graduated from Carleton University with my bachelor's in social work, got right into the field. What brought me to social work was experiences at a young age of homelessness, chronic poverty. For 24 years, I grew up in Ottawa community housing. And so all of those things bring me to social work, bring me to advocacy. I do my work from my lived and personal experience, and it informs my professional lens and experience as well. And, you know, I'm just really dedicated to communities of color, especially queer and trans communities of color. I've been out as an LGBTQ person in general for a while now, but I've only been out as a trans person, I would say, for probably 3 years. It took me a bit to come to terms for it with myself. And I think, you know, being of Jamaican descent and being Black is very significant to my journey in coming to self. And so since coming to self and even before coming to self, you know, I volunteered at a few organizations in Ottawa, Kind Space included, trying to create spaces for communities of color who are also queer and who are also trans. So that's why I'm here today, you know, to give my perspective, my lived experience. And so like, gracious, it's just so wonderful to share space with such wonderful panelists. So glad to be here.
Thank you so much, Noah. And fun fact for everybody, when I came out in the community, Noah was like a little bit older and I was always like, oh, hi, Noah. And so it's very, yeah, I love when worlds come back together. Maëlys, would you be up to introduce yourself next?
Hi, everyone. My name is Maëlys, she and her pronouns. I'm Francophone. I also have been in Ottawa my whole life, so yay, hi. And yeah, so in terms of queer stuff, activism-wise, I started getting more involved in advocacy work with the ban on GSAs that was through Ontario for all the Catholic schools. So doing advocacy work to prohibit those bans. Went to my first trans march in 2010 here in Ottawa and continued being involved in advocacy. And so my kind of specialty has been to document both media representation of trans people within Canada, but also transphobia within Ottawa at large, mostly out of frustration for the lack of coverage or how it was represented. For instance, like this, there's been like a really pronounced white nationalist movement in Canada since 2019, especially. Coinciding with the rise in the States and with Brexit, kind of this moment, in this particular moment, Bolsonaro in Brazil, this particular moment around the world. And there's been a peculiar kind of activism that's been happening in across Canada. A bunch of prides have been disrupted. We saw the violence in Hamilton. We saw violence in Toronto, Vancouver, soldiers of Odin showing up. So stuff like that, right? Like documenting that because our institutions are failing us. Otherwise, I am a trans girl stereotype in being a software developer and very much liking pickles, which despite not needing Spyro anymore, I have not lost that desire for salt. So yeah, that's me.
I have like a hard time, like, so I'm playing like a moderator panelist duo role today because I also just love the people, but also like Maëlys has been doing like such phenomenal work tracking and recording anti-trans hate in this city, and nobody else is doing that work. And so I feel like she usually plays the behind the scenes role in such a phenomenal way. And I am so grateful to have you here with us. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And now last but not least is the way that we say it. Jaime, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Faye. My name's Jaime. I use they, them pronouns. I did not grow up in Ottawa. I grew up in the GTA. I've been here about 6 years. And the organization that brought me to this panel is I'm involved with Horizon Ottawa, which is, I think the best way to describe it is a grassroots organization who's focused on making Ottawa more progressive, specifically at the municipal level. And I think something that's very important to me kind of within the conversations we have at Horizon, but also in larger conversations, is the way that progressive issues connect to each other. So today I've been thinking a lot about transit with the O train and the city council meeting. And I think people often don't think of transit as a 2S LGBT issue, but it is, because queer and trans people are more likely to be poor and therefore more likely to use public transit. And so I think that interconnection and that network of the way that if something impacts marginalized people in one way, it's probably impacting them in a multitude of other ways that you're not thinking about. My day job, when I'm not at Horizon, I have two. I work in the equity office at Carleton as the trans and non-binary inclusion coordinator, and I do communications work for Options Bytown, which is a supportive housing provider. And I graduated from Carleton in 2020 with a communications degree and a minor in theater. And I think the thing for me that connects all those different pies that I have fingers in is storytelling. I think stories are really, really powerful. I think stories can play a really strong role for good, but I think they can also be very insidious and be used in very harmful ways. And I think with the trans community, the stories that are being told right now about transphobia and like gender critical ideology being hidden under like a lens of progressivism and the co-opting of the language of identity politics to hurt trans people is, I think, something that's really insidious and something that no media is really covering the way it should be covered. Yeah, so that's kind of where I come from. I feel very honored to be sharing this space with some really incredible folks tonight. I'm looking forward to chatting more.
Thank you so much. I'm now realizing I didn't introduce myself. So Fae Johnstone, she, they pronouns, Executive Director of Wisdom to Action. I've been doing trans organizing in Ottawa for a number of years and spent a lot of my time ranting about the federal government's inaction and inadequate action on 2S LGBTQ issues and failure to denounce anti-trans hate in this country. So for our first question, and we have a bunch of questions, so we're going to do again popcorn style, and we'll let the conversation go where it goes. But my first question for folks is, safety is kind of at the crux of this panel, the ability to be safe in our bodies, in our lives, and in our communities. And it means a lot of different things to us depending on who we are and what barriers we experience in public space. So I wonder, when you think about safety, what does that actually mean to you? What would safety, or what does safety look like to you in your community? And in this context, just feel free to jump on in.
I have a thought, and I think it's something that a lot of cis people probably don't think about, so I think it might be useful for this conversation. Most of the trans people I know, not all, I think there are some people who have been out long enough or who are at a point where this is an issue for them, but most trans people I know, every time they leave their house, do a sort of calculus between what makes me feel like me and what is not gonna, like, what has the least chance of getting me yelled at or getting me assaulted or getting me murdered. And I think every single day, I think all queer people do it, but I think for trans people and especially trans feminine people, I do that calculus when I run across the street to Shoppers to grab like a vitamin water. And so I think, to me, a world that feels safe for trans people is a world where that is not a thought that ever crosses anyone's mind. And I think it's something to be conscious of if you are a cis person when you're talking to trans people, or when you're talking about trans issues, that I guarantee you every trans person you know does that little mental math every time they leave the house.
Definitely. And if I could jump off of Jamie's points, I think those are excellent points. And I think when I think about this question about safety, as I was thinking about it, I thought about that exactly what Jamie mentioned. You know, folks have to do this weighing of pros and cons when they leave the house, right? And then that led me to the thought of, you know, what does that mean in terms of like mental health, physical health? What does it mean, you know, to intentionally like isolate yourself or like be isolated because of the circumstances that, like, because safety is non-existent, right? And so how does this impact folks' mental health, not to be able to like go to the grocery store? Or how does it impact folks' mental health or just health in general to say like, hey, I might need to like visit the doctor, but I don't want to deal with it today. I know that like if I go into this space, like I'm going to experience this and this is how it's going to affect my mood, my vibe, I have things to do. So, you know, I think that the fact that a lot of us like intentionally isolate ourselves from doing more things that we probably would want to do is an indicator that like safety is virtually sometimes feels non-existent for us. And I think that's a significant point.
I think another thing too is when people, like when cis people discuss trans people and when like doctors and whatever theorize about trans people, they see that kind of as like a transitory step, like, oh yeah, but eventually, you know, you're on HRT long enough or you've had the surgery, you know, that ends. And it's like, no, not at all. And especially for like non-binary trans feminine people or, you know, trans guys who, you know, HRT is not for them. There's always, you know, this is our reality. And there's just not, it feels like all the policy making doesn't take that into account.
Yeah, I sort of want to echo off of that and sort of like talk like and reiterate sort of just like not only just like having to like meticulously plan every day, but even like folks who are just trying to like go for a date, like go for a coffee, have to have I'm a trans and you know with exclamation points and constantly it's the constant thing of having to disclose. You can never be you have to explain, answer questions, be an encyclopedia for every person when you're just trying to figure yourself out. And also I think one of the biggest issues is trust, you know, and especially for safety, you're going to have trust. If, you know, I have dealt with issues where, you know, I have been sexually, you know, dealing with trans misogyny and trans misogynoir, where I'm in a situation where I've been assaulted and I don't trust the Ottawa Police Service. I don't trust the Halifax Regional Police to go and deal with any of my problems, you know, or to effective because I either feel like I'm going to get gaslit. And oftentimes this is not just a hunch, but based off of previous experiences and experiences that other trans elders have passed on. And I think that's something that's like really important where safety is not automatically afforded. And we're often have to get community knowledge when the municipal, federal, provincial governments are not willing to do anything where we're having to find out information. And I think that like safety to me, like if we're going to define it on a more like sort of level, it's like advocacy, infrastructure, and security. And like these are things that we're often missing, right? It's like it's so great to have a community center where you have security, you have a place to meet people, feel comfortable, where you feel like you're not going to be threatened every time. But like if you don't have clear like legal protection, you know, for violence or for hate, or you know, if you don't have access to like housing or things of that sort, you know, then you're not going to feel safe. And I think that like that safety also looks different depending on age. You know, I know a lot of young people who do not feel safe, but that's because they haven't, you know, they've recently come out, they're now denied employment or their first jobs. Well, you might have somebody who's older who might be dealing with transphobia in a completely different way, you know, where they're going through, but they may have had 30 years in their career where they maybe have the economical means to be able to navigate through some of the systems like electrolysis or types of additional surgeries that they may need in order to help them with their transition, which loops back to the first point that was made where it's like, you know, for some cis people, like I don't have it on now, but usually I wear a fake wedding ring, an engagement ring, so that I don't get harassed in public, you know, or because oftentimes since, you know, my transition has changed where as a trans woman, where oftentimes I now am read as a cis woman, but then I get harassed with that misogyny. And then when they find out I am not a woman or my voice slips or I get angry or I get upset, angry Black woman, Black women are already masculinized. So imagine being a trans and now being read with your Adam's apple, whatever the case may be. These instances happen, and they happen in such a variety of way. If you're non-binary, if you're a trans dude, these things, like the way that safety looks is going to look different depending on where you're coming from and where someone's transition is. And if you do not have a system or a centralized or a support network that is accessible, easy to read, then you're not going to feel safe. And of course, you're going to make that calculus before you leave the house and be like, all right, do I need to put on a pile of makeup to go pick up a razor and some Cheetos from the corner store, where in many cases you do have people planning those things. And I have been happy to get help from some people on this panel regarding things, but I spent 10 years out and could never manage to get medication or access to healthcare. I only recently started hormones, and I've been out for a very long time. I had such a hard navigation, especially moving to Ottawa. It was, luckily there was a trans clinic here, but that's not enough. Ottawa has the bare minimum, let alone what other cities have. And for a capital city where there is such a large population of trans people, to not have those sort of resources available, where a trans person, or even a gender-based violence resource that is not trans inclusive, you're kind of out of options. And so the only person you can phone is a friend or somebody that or somebody that that's gone through that experience, or you're looking on Reddit to see if someone has answered the question for you. So it is, again, security, infrastructure and advocacy are so important for safety. And if you have those three, then you might be able to get some trust. And trust is so important when trying to navigate any services or any sort of things that can help with safety.
I love that. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Maëlys.
No, sorry for interrupting.
I was just going to add, I think what I'm hearing so far is safety means and looks different to different people. And that to me has also been a journey of I think when a lot of us come out, the early years feel so intense. Every moment is God violence. And that is the case. Violence is all around us, but violence also is complicated. But I want to highlight the fact that imagine, I think older trans women, it's not that the violence is necessarily less, it's more that you become hardened to it because you almost have to be. And I think that is a thing that is scary to imagine. Even for me, I'm 26, I've been out for 6 years. And I'm I got broad shoulders, I got a deep voice, I'm fairly tall, I used to be a hockey jock, I got some vibes going in the best kinds of ways. I think to me, safety is a world where people don't have to be hardened, where people are able to be soft. And I think we talk a lot about, trans women are constructed as angry and aggressive. And the older I get, the more I'm oh, I get why some of us are angry and aggressive. It's because the world is evil to us. I think to me, it's a world where we don't have to become hard in order to survive, and where we are invited to be gentle with ourselves and allowed to be in public space without having to do the check. The who's around me, is that person who made a sound, are they looking at me? Or are they talking to me? And I don't think cis folks realize, I always struggle with many of us experience harassment, and cis women experience misogyny in public. But I don't think folks realize the particular flavors that are targeted at trans people. There is a level of disgust that I think is particularly not just the trans women and trans feminine folks, but very common among, and a feeling of you shouldn't even be, how dare you exist in public space? This idea that you should be ashamed of the very act of being. And when I don't feel that, when I don't have that feeling I am trying, the world is trying to tell me to feel that shame, that is when I will feel safe. Maëlys, sorry, back to you.
No, and I mean, you're 100% right. I've lost count of the amount of times that people have mocked me openly as a social lubricant between themselves, which is something that cis people don't experience. Actually, that's not true, but the majority of cis people don't experience. I was just gonna say, when we're talking about safety, so we're talking about the safety of today, but people are also impacted by the violence of yesterday. So if you are a trans person and you came out 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and you experienced a lot of trauma, and your job prospects were really diminished 30 years ago, that extends into the present, right? That trauma extends for that person to the present. You can do whatever, and that's great for the new generation, that they won't have that. But it's the trauma keeps going, because even though we put these measures, we don't correct past wrongs. And so that is like, yeah, so when I think of safety, I not only think of like, okay, yeah, you know what, for the baby queers coming out today, what can we do? But I also think, this person that had they been cis would have had housing security, would have been able to have all these things in their lives. They were denied that. Yeah.
I also want to add to that, because I think it brings up a really important thing around language. And, constantly language, I always say language is changing every 10 years. But something that also is like really hard is, when folks were talking about like being able to be soft or being able to just be themselves, I think Noah was also, people just want to be them. And I think one of the things that is really difficult is how we decide to label ourselves. I mean, many of us probably label ourselves very differently. Sorry, I have a bit of a cold. But one of the things that is really hard is that the term trans has changed so much over time, and the ways in which we sort of look at how people decide to, like, there may be people that I know personally who are trans or who identify as trans, but may use the term cross-dresser or use the term transvestite and other words to describe themselves that get instantly demonized, either by the community itself or by cis folks who do not understand about the history of trans people and the way that identifications work. There were many trans women who identified as drag queens because there wasn't a term and they were part of the culture. And so I think, along with sort of recognizing that sort of like time, and looking at oppression, also looking at the ways in which people have historically looked and called themselves, and really respecting people and in terms of how they decide to label themselves. And unfortunately, the stigmas that come with the older terms are often used to perpetuate further violence. And so it becomes, really hard for people to sort of fit themselves, or they're trying to fit themselves, but now they have to use a term that everyone new is using and that best represents them. And that can be really difficult. All to say is that like a lot of folks come out at different times in their lives or have been out for very periods of time. And like, as queer folks, or the queer folks, you got to give patience for folks and you got to let folks kind of figure themselves out. And for the straight folks, you just got to have that nuance and sort of understand the history of like violence and queer violence and trans violence that have taken over the period of time, because transgender wasn't really popularized until the 1990s, but trans people have existed for millennia, and again, we are talking through a very Western view of gender without even getting into gender or trans identities that look very different in other cultures. But I wanted to add that as well, since we started going around about time, and it's so important.
I want to give a moment for anybody else to jump in, or Noah, over to you.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say, like, Jade, like just facts. Like I totally agree. And you have me thinking about like intergenerational dynamics and intercommunity dynamics and what that means. And I think, as somebody who was like young and came out, it's something I thought about a lot. And I think like internally, in our communities, we can do better in terms of like thinking about safety within our communities when we're sharing space together, right? And what does it look like to like do a bit less policing of folks' language, because, maybe they're older and that language that they're using is language that feels good to them. But as like, maybe younger folks, like that has been considered now problematic or triggering language, right? And so how do we have conversations with each other, recognizing that, we're not coming at each other to harm each other, we're just trying to understand where we're coming from. And I think that creates safe, it doesn't create safety, but it helps us feel safer, in sharing space together. And I think that it's a real, it's something to think about, when I think about the community and access to community and older trans folks. And I think that's really important.
And I think we've seen, like, I had the pleasure of chatting with some older trans folks for some work stuff over the last few weeks. And it was like there is that divide, right? Like we have younger generations of trans folks who I think are very militant around our identities. And I think there's power and potential in that militancy. But then it gets processed through cis folks who don't, I think as younger trans folks, we need to manage how we give space and honor the histories and the resilience of older trans people who have given us the world around us. It was not cis folks who created progress in this country for trans people. It never has been. But I also think it gets filtered through cis folks who, only process the 101 and don't have space for the complexity of identity. I love older trans women who call themselves transsexuals, or who maybe use the word cross-dresser, and that is the way that they understand their identity, and that bashes up against how I think about my gender, but that isn't an attack on me. That is a different way of living in our worlds. I wonder, and I really appreciate folks, sharing their own experiences and identities at this stage. I think this is a really good way to start the conversation. But one of the things I really want us to dive into is talking about violence against trans people. Particularly, the violence is a spectrum, right? Like it exists in a whole bunch of different ways. But a lot of the most explicit forms of hate or anti-trans hate are the only ones that we talk about. But we also know that they're upheld by broader attitudes, opinions, ideologies, and beliefs. When it comes to those explicit forms, though, what are you, and so in that case, anti-trans protests, stickering, explicit moments of slurs and bigotry and harassment and stalking. What are some of the ways that y'all have seen or would recommend in terms of addressing explicit forms of anti-trans hate in our cities? How do we fight the tip of the iceberg?
I can jump in. I think something that always stands out to me is one of the things about the iceberg effect is that those maybe less explicitly violent forms of transphobia and transmisogyny are what enable the more violent ones. So if I'm walking down the street and I see the way people are looking at me, and they're looking at me through the corner of their eye, and they're looking at me like I'm not like I'm another person, like I'm a freak show, you know what I mean? That then enables someone who is maybe more angry about their transphobia to call me a slur or to assault me, right? And I think one of the small things that you can do is to not necessarily mark yourself as a safe person, but to make a comment that diffuses that. So I think one that I've caught is if someone compliments my nails or compliments my makeup or my jewelry or my clothes, a cis person complimenting a trans person on transgressing gender norms often will, I have seen it, I've seen someone looking at me and then I've gotten a compliment and that person stops looking at me. And I think it's something that can be very small and easy for you to do as a cis person, but really just kind of diffuses a situation. And I don't think that always works, but I think it is something that you can really keep an eye out for.
So one trick that I use, and again, Kavit's doesn't work in all situations, but I take a picture of them because that inverts the power balance and suddenly they don't like it. And it makes, it just feels good. But the point I would make orthogonally is, so in Ontario, Angus Reid did a study, 22% of Ontarians are uncomfortable with a trans person moving next door. And we're dealing with a culture where anti-trans jokes are normalized. We see it in our movies, in our TV, and even though they might be slightly less common today than they were just 5 years ago, people are informed by 5 years ago in terms of how they go about the world. And so when I think of all this anti-trans violence, I think that it's quite difficult to be able to address it because it comes from not one point source, but 1,000. And so when I think of this violence, I think, okay, so how do we increase safety for trans people? How do we make it so that they're more resilient? And so I think of housing, because we know that half of trans people make less than 30K, right? And so, and we're in a city where the average one bedroom is 1,600, and it's gone up 60% in 4 years, right? Where I think someone can correct me, but ODSP provides like $490 for housing. So it's not a place where you can live. And so if you were to give trans people the ability to not worry about housing, right, by taking a bunch of measures that we can take, then you're making them more resilient so that when invariably we are subject to this violence, we are better able to live on and to have, to live on.
Sorry, trying to navigate my unmute button. I think something I want to echo sort of what folks have been saying, but also talk about, you know, when we look at the tip of the iceberg, that's often not just what people see, but also like, even so, I experienced a lot of violence back when I first came out around 2014. I'll share a little anecdote in 2017, before I came to self and recognized what worked for me. And, you know, I think, Noah, you mentioned at the beginning, sort of the difference between sort of just like, you know, dressing up for you. Like if I were to look the way that I would want to in my gender expression, I'd look like T-Boss from TLC. And people know what T-Boss looked like, you know, short hair, all of that. But oftentimes I dress bougie. I dress, you know, in a way where, you know, they call me, you know, my alter ego is called Judith, and, you know, move through the world as Judith in order to sort of like survive things. And one of the things that is really hard is that even in the last few years, no matter how much I've tried to, you know, even just since J.K. Rowling decided to open her big mouth, we've noticed that when high profile people, you know, either be transgender folks in sports, either be anything where there is controversy, you know, humans have singular minds. You know, they're going to be, especially if they're upset about something, they're going to catch the tail end and go for the whole entire, you know, the whole entire ride. And so we see not only this increase, but TERFs have been organizing for so long, and they're very well organized because many of them identify as feminists, and many of them have been organizers and do not. And now, obviously, we know that TERFs are, you know, trans misogynists, but they are also just transphobic to all trans people. And so one of the things that is like really hard to do is when they're validified. When people take them seriously. I mean, you should take them seriously as they pose a danger into the lives and the autonomy and the freedom of trans people. But when you have a situation where, you know, where there is sort of an ambivalence to trans issues. So in Canada, you know, we have, you know, we're now recently just protected under, you know, criminal code or whatnot, but there was not, you know, while there has been trans hate, it isn't looking like at least what it looked like today than what it did in the early 10s. And the reason why I say that is because there has been such a move to target trans people and take away our rights. I mean, why are you going to try to, people wanting to criminalize folks peeing? You know, I don't like, that is a huge problem. And so I think one of the ways to really support sort of anti-trans hate is recognizing the subversive ways in which trans people, or not trans people, but people who are against trans people, so TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists, or any transphobic people, the way that they use their strategies. And I think it's really important that we create an ambience of trans positivity in our cities, specifically in Ottawa. You know, there needs to be a clear message from the city of like, trans people are welcome here. If you want to move here, come move here. But the city has to back it up. They have to create more subsidized housing. They have to create more emergency shelters. You know, I've been turned away from women's shelters before because I didn't fit the bill enough, you know, and when you're having to deal with that situation and not be able to have not even spaces, let alone be able to be accepted in the spaces that already exist, this is a huge problem. Because again, the more that you are in the street, the more harassed you tend to be. I mean, you know, last week I was harassed twice in public in ways, and especially since this pandemic hit, we've seen the ways that people have become more extreme with their views, you know, either it be COVID, either it be vaccines, either it be many of these controversial things that have happened. You know, trans issues really shouldn't be that controversial. You know, I go to work, I do, you know, we do the things, we're trying to live our lives, and yet we're constantly being policed by people who have no idea about who we are and what we're going through. And so I think that's really important, at least in terms of like creating that ambience and really trying to create, and especially, and I also want to talk to the service providers who may be sort of like on the call, like you can't just say you're pro-trans and then say that. You need to look at your policies, you need to work with your frontline staff, you need to, you know, and about how you're approaching trans people. Simple things, and I know folks on the panel might be like, oh, Jade, we talk about this all the time, but a simple thing of even just introducing yourself by your pronouns or having it on your bio. You may think that's not a lot, but you're creating an environment where, you know, where your people, when I see someone's pronouns on their bio, I immediately know that they're somewhat competent on trans things. There's a little bit of trust. Even if I don't fully trust you, it's enough that I'm going to be like, okay, this person is clearly telling me that they are she, her, they, them, zer, it goes on, who they are, you know, and not just telling me to guess. Because again, I don't know, you know, I don't know who you are, you know, and so tell me, open up a little bit. And when we put our pronouns in, we open it, because again, you know, it's either trans people constantly having to correct folks and when we talk about the iceberg, you know, cis folks often wonder why, you know, trans folks get so angry when pronouns are not respected, right? And oftentimes this is what we talk about. And the issue is that that's deep to think. How many times has that person had to correct their pronouns that day or that month or that week? How many people have been denied services or denied shelter or denied, you know, violence prevention and access to frontline services because they are not, and oftentimes if a person is misgendered or they're not going to come back to that service. They're not going to access that service because they're not going to be respected for who they are. And so I can talk forever, but I think just to summarize, when the issues that we talk about, and oftentimes we as trans folks that are talked about, are just the surface issues because they're all deep down laid with trauma, intersected with racism. If you're from a rural community, that adds to it. If you're from poverty, that adds to it. If you're from a Christian background, that adds to it. And I think that, you know, if we are saying we are a progressive society, if we're saying that trans people are protected under the criminal code and that trans folks are, you know, inherently protected, then the provinces and, you know, the municipalities need to start acting up and stepping up. Because again, you know, we're talking about safety, we're talking about anti-trans hate. If you don't legislate it, it won't happen. And so again, like, we have to ensure that folks are protected, and it's not a lot. And I think the hardest, one of the most difficult or mind frustrating, there's probably people on this panel who've wanted to rip their hair out, but simple asks, you know, let alone people trying to reverse existing rights, but trying to sort of like fight against trans people and trying to make us go back into the shadows is a very dangerous thing, because we see all these statistics, you know, well, in Canada, there's already a lack of trans and gender, you know, like research, and people who are doing it. CCGSD just did a needs assessment here in Ottawa for youth, but there was also TransPulse, you know, so there is research that gets done, but I think one of the biggest issues is that we don't talk about sort of the people who aren't on the panel, the people who don't live long enough, the people, you know, and again, like, you know, it's a really, trigger warning, but it's a really hard thing to talk about suicide, but it happens so common and it happens all the time. And these things are comorbid. You know, transphobia doesn't exist by itself. You know, it's not the only thing that impacts a trans person. And so I think we need to really think about those things in a holistic way and really think about the ambience. What are we doing to be less racist? What are we doing to decolonize? What are we doing to, you know, create an environment where I can go pee, I can go shopping, without having to be harassed or see stupid posters that are meant to target me? That's hate speech. It's hate speech. So what are we going to do about it? And so it's up to the folks in the audience. Sorry, I know I've been going a long panel. I know I've been going on. I'll stop. But really speak up. Speak up. Speak up and speak. You know, I don't want to talk to your racist uncle. I don't want to talk to your transphobe uncle, but you got to do it. You got to do it. And if you're not going to do it, then you got to find ways ambiently. So if you're not confrontational, what are you doing? You know, as folks mentioned, are you going and complimenting somebody? Are you going and just reaffirming that you're here? You know, what are ways that you are, you know, don't fetishize trans people, but what are you doing to be like, I'm here, I see you? You know, someone just, you know, I was on the bus one time and I got harassed and somebody was just like, I see you. And that literally, that one comment made my entire day. And so, because again, oftentimes trans people feel alone. So, you know, you don't have to be like, I support trans people, but be like, that was unacceptable, and move on, like, you know, or step up, you know? So anyways, yeah, it's a tip of the iceberg. We could talk about so much.
Definitely, and I want to chime in here as well, with the preface of like my fellow panelists have put it so well, and I won't spend too much time because if I'm being completely honest, I haven't experienced a lot of hate publicly from strangers for being transgender, and I think that's a very significant thing that I want to name, and I think that's a privilege, and I think that it's not fair that people who are trans feminine are disproportionately affected by hate and violence, and you know that's not right, and there's reasons why that is what it is, but it's just not fair. And I think for me, you know, being before coming out as trans, identifying as LGBTQ, having lots of trans folks, working with lots of trans folks, I was already aware of the experiences of anti-trans hate, of lack of safety that existed within trans communities. That is really significant and you know, important to trans and non-binary communities specifically outside of the LGBT, you know, LGB in general. And so what I will say is that as somebody in my previous work who supported trans folks in navigating health services in the city, that the hate is there, and that people are experiencing hate. And that what I want to say is that, you know, for a second, can be like, we're not going to forget being trans because it's our power, and you know what, it is powerful, despite what you think or whatever ideals you're coming to this space today. What I want to say is that you know, before we're trans, we're human beings, right? Like we are humans, right? And we have to share the world together. And I want folks to think about like how much energy it takes to walk outside and hear comments and get catcalled and be harassed. Do you know how much, and like to have that happen for like, you know, at different points of the day for like 8 hours, and then to come home and look at yourself in the mirror? I want folks to think about how hard it is now to like affirm yourself and not let that get to you, right? Because as a service provider, I can see, you know, the impacts in terms of mental health. I can see the impacts in terms of access to service. You know, I can see the social determinants of health, these kind of things we theorize about really like manifesting. Like people are not well, you know, and people are human beings. They deserve respect. Just as, you know, a cisgender person, you deserve respect too, right? You deserve to live as your fullest self, right? And so that's something that I really want to sort of put in folks' mind, that, you know, folks are human beings. And, you know, like if, you know, outside of being transgender, we're human, and, you know, we deserve to be treated as human beings. And, you know, this kind of like animalistic approach to like with the hate and you know, the lack of safety we experience is not okay.
I have just one small thought I want to share. And I think everyone else has made really, really incredible points, but I want to build off something that Jade said about pronouns, because I think pronouns are really important and they're really useful. But I think if you're going to put your pronouns in your email signature or on your name tag, there's some work that comes with that. And I think there are some people who, I encounter this in my work at Carleton a lot. There are people who will put their pronouns in their signature and think, okay, I'm a like #1 trans ally. I love the transes, and then they don't do anything else. But it's almost more painful when I experience transphobia from someone who has their pronouns in their bio than someone who doesn't, because it's like, okay, I thought you were someone who was safe and wasn't. And I want to share an anecdote that connects to this, I promise. It's not mine. It's one that another trans person shared on Twitter today. And Faye, I think you've seen this. Nico Stratus, who is an incredible trans journalist, she wrote a Twitter thread today about driving from Toronto to the Yukon and back, and the transphobia she experienced on that drive, and how it's different to the time she's done that drive before, and how she's felt less safe. And the first reply to that was a guy being like, but the Yukon's been liberal for the last 15 years. Like they always have a liberal MP. And I think that a lot of Canadians, a lot of cis Canadians, I will say, but I think this goes for a lot of social issues, think that because they vote for a progressive party like the Liberals or the NDP, it absolves them from all the personal icky feelings they have about trans people or Black people or disabled people. And I think if you are not doing the work to consciously unlearn your biases and consciously unlearn the trans misogyny you carry, then it doesn't mean anything that you're voting for a party like that. And so I think the way that those two things connect is, you be willing to learn and be willing to make mistakes and acknowledge that you don't have it right. because I think that's the best way you can support trans people.
Thank you, Jamie. My thing I want to add is just to note how much cis folks inadvertently invisibilize anti-trans hate in our city and in communities. I know many trans folks who have been harassed in public space, and I'm not talking like, nobody should ever be harassed, but I'm talking like broad daylight Bank Street kind of experiences, or broad daylight like hanging out downtown doing your thing kinds of stuff. I have had folks like hurl slurs and try to like tell me to get into vehicles when I'm going through the downtown core. And I would like to say, I wish I could say that, folks responded to that, the people around me said, oh God, are you doing okay? You're a stranger who's being harassed. That is a shitty experience. That isn't something that should happen to you. Or at least noticed, not like they noticed it, but they noticed it and then they looked away. They didn't notice it and do the there's a camaraderie, I think is the word, like a nod, right? I see cis women doing it to each other. I give it, and I experience that with cis women on occasion of the I'm sorry that happened, and I see that happened. And that moment where you see the violence that happens, actually, it's not like, A+ gold star ally, but it's a way of acknowledging that it wasn't okay. It's a way of acknowledging that, again, violence against trans people is connected to violence against women, is connected to violence against Black folks, is connected to violence against disabled folks. These systems are interconnected, and we see those moments of violence. And when folks aren't willing to demonstrate and to witness those experiences, it tells us that they're okay. If you look away when someone is being harassed, you need to, that is a problem. But a lot of the time, violence against trans people is constructed as so normal, even by folks who think of themselves as liberals or as progressives or as allies and supporters. I've had family members ignore those moments. I had family members just pretend that that person who we just walked by didn't say a slur. Those are moments where it teaches trans people that we should be used to being attacked and used to being victims of violence. Those are moments that teach us that you don't actually care enough about us to get out of your comfort zone a little bit and just show us that you care. A lot of the time, I want more cis people to be the person that trans people can cry, who the shoulders that we can cry on. And I don't think cis folks realize how much of that pain we don't share with them. That is pain that we keep among ourselves or keep with our partners. And that in and of itself is part of the problem. Okay, noticing that it's almost 8 p.m., I'm gonna move on to my next question. So we know that community is always the ones who are most there for us in moments of violence and harm. And that community is genuinely the place that has kept many of us alive. But I wonder, I think Ottawa isn't doing all that much in terms of building community or building safety. And I'm gonna have a whole series of call to actions on that in a bit. But what are some, from the folks on the call, what are some of the examples in or outside of Ottawa of initiatives that support folks and support trans folks and actually seek to combat anti-trans hate? What are examples of things that you would like to see us doing in Ottawa to support safe cities for trans people?
Okay, so I have two things. One's more of a federal sort of thing, and one is more sort of a provincial or more like a municipal thing. But first things first, I think that one of the things I want to mention, now this is a very controversial bill, more around the terms of privacy of citizens, both for disingenuous and both for genuine concerns and questions. But this is around Bill C-31 or 36 rather, that amends the criminal code, specifically around online hate. And, this is something that's important to watch. It was put on by the Liberals, but it is an important thing to pay attention to, because a lot of the hate that gets stirred in our cities are in back channels, private Facebook groups. This is where people organize. And these are where hate is spread. Things are online. I mean, we've seen people folks who are transphobic organize even during the election through it's called brigading, but going on to trans CBC comments, let's just say on YouTube or CTV or any mainstream news. and just ratioing it so it's super, super low. Look at anything with Jagmeet Singh. It's a racist time there, but this happens all the time online, where people who are racist organize directly online. And so I think one of the things that is really important for governments and things to do is really look at hate, investigate it, and really try to be able to create a way for us to be able to sort of like stop that. And I think it's really hard because online is very much of a public sphere. It's international. Everyone has access to it. Everyone can just put a proxy on, you know, it's very hard to sort of stuff that out. And that's why I think it's like really important for us to be able to sort of, you know, have more, you know, I would say, being able to sort of filter those things out more and being able to sort of like report it. And I know that communities already do that, but being able to sort of like have an avenue where you're like, if I'm seeing hate speech, I can actually do something about it. It is really hard for hate speech to be criminalized in Canada. We rarely see, you know, hate crimes, hate things being, usually it's a, you know, a aggravated assault towards these, but actually getting a pin down to a hate crime when things are obviously motivated by hate is so hard to prove in court, and it's really frustrating. And this is something that's like super important to recognize. And I think when we look more so locally, one of the other things that I think is really important is around sort of like, and we started mentioning this in the chat with hosts, but the decriminalization of sex work, and specifically, you know, as someone who is a former sex worker, I think it's really important for us to have protection measures, regulations, and support for trans folks, especially with human trafficking. And oftentimes, you know, this is a huge issue in Canada, a huge issue in my own hometown. And it's really sort of, and this is what's the word? This is both, you know, there are people who do sex work because they're interested in sex work. And then there are people who do sex work out of necessity because they're pushed and put into the fringes of society and cannot access work, cannot access jobs. There are no protections. And so it's really hard to be able to sort of like navigate that. And then again, like I wasn't able to find work. I got turned down. I got people telling me we don't hire people of your kind here. So, you know, what did I have to do? Do what I know. I already know that I'm fetishized online. I already know that there's 8,000 men, you know, sorry, I want to be inappropriate here, but like, you know, getting off on some trans porn online and then trying to translate those things into real life. And so it's really important that like governments and organizations are really clear on messaging about who trans people are, who we are, and ensuring that there is, you know, actual real legal protection and ramifications for trans hate. You know, it's just like, you know, I'm not looking to criminalize somebody for using the wrong pronoun and making a mistake, but there's a difference between intentional harm and unintentional harm and harassment. And I think that like Canada has done a poor job in combating that, because if they actually combated that, we wouldn't see the increase of hate that we have seen. I felt it, folks on the panel have felt it. It's a very different time to be trans. I am more recognizing how much trans I am than in any other sort of situation. And so I think it's just like, again, it's like, this is a crisis. This has been a crisis, but now it's very acute. And so I think that like, I don't know if this answers the question, but again, I think that there are ways, you know, to tackle things. I know we have some call to actions, but definitely federally, I think, you know, we need to make sure that, you know, hate laws are and sort of, you know, we are criminalizing hate, and or at least now I'm a transformative justice person, but again, I think that like there needs to be sort of a fear of causing harm to trans people, because right now they don't feel any fear at all.
Yeah, and with regards to hate, like not only is it not criminalized here, but it's actually, we're using the public funds to subsidize hate speech, right? Like, for instance, the Ottawa Public Library has 26 copies of The Transgender Craze, which is a book that is conspiratorial, completely unfounded, based on conspiracy theories from anti-trans forums that became a bestseller. And we're paying for that. Parliament right here in Ottawa inviting TERFs to speak and to have presence, and there's an effect there because that is then repeated through our media networks. It gets posted on our newspapers. It's yeah, so there's like that. But going back to kind of the topic of sex work, like, you know, one way we can make our communities safer here is, you know, where there's like police reform, but there's also reducing the likelihood of interacting with the police at all to make people safer, because we're not safe generally when we interact with the police. We're less safe when the police are there. And so one example is, you know, you were talking about like sex work, and like sex work is intentionally being conflated with sex trafficking in order to outlaw sex work, consensual and safe sex work. And in the Ottawa area with the Ottawa police, they've been going after sex workers, right? So what does that do? Well, that makes things less safe for trans and non-binary sex workers, 96% of which Transpal study are not comfortable going to the police and do not trust the legal system to give a favorable outcome. And yet this population is overrepresented in terms of sexual, being victims of sexual assault. It's like, oh, I have a stat here somewhere, but for trans people overall, it's 26%, and it's even higher if you're a sex worker. So, you know, yeah. So for me, it's like, what are the things we can do to reduce interactions with police? We could start collecting data. Police does not need to be involved for data collection, right? We could, for questions of like interfacing with places that require ID, like established, you know, pubs and whatnot, right? So there can be problems there. So you make it part of the licensing process to bring education so that it's less likely that the police are involved. Just like, what are the millions of little things, because this change isn't going to be, you know, we can't get to, there's not one change here that's going to take us to the world where we want to be, right? It's going to be tons and tons of small changes. So what are the small changes that make it less likely that we ever have to deal with the police?
I also like, I know, you know, I think self-defense classes are like are not a long-term solution, but you know, what are the ways that we help trans folks survive those terrible and violent moments, right? Like, what are the ways, you know, so say self-defense classes that are trans inclusive in nature, and maybe even specific to trans people. I also think, you know, helping cis folks know how to be a shoulder to cry on. Like, where are the bystander intervention programs? Where are the crisis support programs? Also, you know, Noah has spoken to like service providers a number of times, right? Like, the 101 on don't be a bigot isn't enough. If you're working in housing, for example, are you actually planning for what to do if you're helping a trans person visit a landlord for the first time and they get harassed on the way to that landlord? Are you actually figuring out what to do and what your role is if the landlord misgenders the trans client or tenant? A lot of this is not, a lot of the time we're too responsive on addressing transphobia when our service providers in particular need to be proactive. Are you chatting with, and like, trans folks know this. We know we're going to get some icky stuff in public. We know there's going to be awkward moments around our gender. We know there's going to be some hate. And so you can actually have the conversation with trans folks of what do you need? How do you want me to respond in instances or moments of transphobia or trans misogyny? What are the things that you would like me to do? The answer is never yell really loudly, oh my God, you're so bad to trans people, because then all the people around us are going to look at us weird and it's going to get worse. But actually asking individual trans people, how are we keeping ourselves safe? What do our safety plans look like? What would we need from you in a crisis? To me, it's the like, for my fiance, like it's like squeeze my hand and let's walk away together. And that's literally it 99% of the time. It's just like, notice it with me and then let's get out of here. But those are programs that aren't readily available and that many cis folks aren't aware of. Are there any other examples of programs or services or initiatives around fighting anti-trans hate that we should be looking at in Ottawa?
I do want to chime in here and say that, you know, it's really important to consider, you know, sort of like activating yourself if you have resources, especially financial resources, to support initiatives that support trans folks in the city. So for example, you know, something that I wanted to mention, you know, during this question is this legal firm, Gowling WLG. They work in partnership with a Canadian Center for Gender and Sexual Diversity to provide pro bono legal services to trans folks who are wanting to change their gender markers or change their legal name. To get a lawyer to sign off on those documents is super expensive. And, I'm not sure of the intricacies of that partnership, but, that offering that service pro bono is something that helps ensure helps further safety for trans folks in the city, because folks run into issues when your ID does not match what you look like, or your ID just doesn't reflect who you are. And I think that can be considered a safety issue, I would argue. And not having the right ID or not having things that feel good in terms of your documents can lead to hate in different ways. And so what are you doing to help us protect ourselves? And how are you kind of acknowledging these barriers and doing something about it with the resources that you have? So that's something that I wanted to mention. And I think that there are, a few good folks doing really great work in the city, but, their capacity is really low. And a lot of folks who are doing great work are doing this work as being trans or non-binary folks. And so, burnout is very real, capacity is very real, so what does that look like? I do know of a really great organization not based in Ottawa, but again, Justice Trans. They're a trans advocacy organization, and they provide access to legal support for trans folks. And I think that they're really great, but again, it's trans folks doing the work for each other. So again, just a note for folks, think about how much work it is, to not only support ourselves, but support our communities, because we're all going through it together. And so, using your resources to support our initiatives, I think is really significant.
I think I want to jump off that as well. Another Canadian resource that I think is really important. It's not Ottawa based, but we've talked a lot tonight about service providers. And I think one of the hardest things for trans people is accessing medical care, whether it's going to see a doctor or going to see a counselor. I've had hour-long therapy sessions that I have paid for, where I spend half of it educating my therapist about what it means for me to be dysphoric and what it means for me to be a trans feminine person. And I'm like, okay, so I'm paying you, but this is what I do at work. And so if you are a service provider, or if you know a service provider, the community-based resource center, along with a host of other partners, recently developed a toolkit for service providers on how to support trans patients. So I think that's a really great resource. One other thing I wanted to shout out that's not necessarily about anti-trans hate, but more about building trans community, is the Transpure Network, which was launched by a trans person out of Toronto earlier this year, when a lot of community spaces like Kind Space had to close their doors because of COVID-19. And it's an online space for trans people. And I think seeing more spaces like that is awesome, especially because a lot of trans folks maybe can't be out in real life because of their circumstances. So I think, digital spaces for trans people are really awesome as well.
I got so in the habit of just sitting back and basking in brilliance from our panelists that I was like, oh, wow, there's more questions to ask. I want to shift gears a little bit around, so actually I'm going to come back. In terms of initiatives, I do want to highlight, self-defense is good. Also, a lot of our streets aren't well lit, and that does have an impact. City streets that are dark in evenings does make folks feel safe. I moved to Vanier, and I love Vanier, and I think Vanier is a phenomenal, brilliant neighborhood, but there aren't streetlights in as many places as there are downtown. And so literally that there are infrastructure, and somebody asked the question earlier around in the Q&A around infrastructure. Infrastructure that has well-lit areas means that there are escape mechanisms, there are places you can run to, and there is a impression of safety. It's not always true, but it at least minimizes the risk of violence. That being said, we've talked a lot tonight about icky people and icky instances of anti-trans hate. And I kind of want to shift gears to think about, still kind of on an unpleasant narrative of, we live in a world that harasses trans people. But what do folks do to care for themselves? And more generally, what advice would folks have for folks who are struggling with the brunt of anti-trans hate in this city. What can we do, or what can individuals do? What are the tips for folks to cope with that violence? What has worked for you, and what do you know has worked for others?
I can go. Sorry, I was just trying to answer some questions in, and I also I accidentally said that I answered live to one of the questions. I'm just going to send a note afterwards, just the written version, but trying to answer some of the questions. Anyways, I think one of the ways in which folks who are impacted of violence, like, I mean, not to be corny, but recognizing that you're not alone. And I think that, like, there are a lot of trans folks who are working at organizations such as Kind Space that are here to lend an ear and here to support you the best ways that we can. I think it's really hard. Oh, one of the things I should have mentioned, funding. For anything, for any infrastructure, trans folks, and, like, you know, just to us LGBT organizations and things in general, we need funding. We can't do things without any funds. We can't offer the supports with any funds. If we're having to beg on the bottom of our feet, and I'm not talking about one's funding, we're not talking about a $15 million grant, $19 million, $20 million grant going out to us LGBT organizations. No, sustainable funding is required. Anyway, sorry, derailing. But I think one of the things that is really important is recognizing that not only are there people that you can access to ask for help, but also recognizing that, you know, that violence may happen in the city, but there are places to go to, even though they may not, and that people are working really hard to try to prevent these things from happening. I'm more of I hate to be sort of one of those somber people, or doomers, is the term that's being used, and I don't think that's the case at all here. But I think that, like, you know, we have to get out of the mindset that things are going to get worse before they get better. But even though that things seem like they're worse right now, there are opportunities for you to be able, or for us to be able to work together. And so I think it was mentioned earlier, but really being able to build community, really being able to find ways. Community doesn't have to happen in person. It can happen online. Kind Space partially went online, and there's a whole community that emerged from, you know, different servers that we have. You know, there were ways for people to be able to sort of, you know, come together. And it's also really important, like, and I like that like, you're able to know what your limits are. And I think for a lot of, you know, like a lot of the times where trans people end up getting violence is when they're open about their transness, or they're fighting for something, or they're very public, you know, and you don't have to be public to experience violence. That's not what I'm saying at all. But what does happen is a lot of trans folks feel afraid of stepping out or talking about things, or being able to raise their voices and find their voices, because they're afraid that they're going to get attacked. If you want to raise your voice, we're here. I'm here. We're in the city. I don't plan on moving anytime soon. I may be a Nova Scotian, but there are people here who love you. There are people who care about you, because oftentimes we have to create our own families and our own communities. And I know that's not an instant way of solving hate, but we got to be here for each other. We have to be ready to support one another when there is no community or any provincial, federal, or municipal support. And we have to advocate for that. But if it's just us alone, if it's just us by ourselves, if it's just us living in silos trying to ask for support, it's going to be really hard to get. And there are so many trans people living in the city. I literally moved to Ottawa and I was like, oh my God, we're here. You know, for the first time, I saw a Black trans woman that wasn't me looking in the mirror in my own hometown. And that was so important. And so I think for, you know, being someone who runs a space, and now that we're reopening, I think it's a lot easier to sort of create those community spaces where folks can come in and sort of be able to unpack the experiences that they're having. But again, it's just like, it's not over. You do have support. It may not be the support that you're needing right now, but there is, I guess, hope. I know it's really hard to hope. That's why I said doomer, because it's like, it's hard to hope when there's a lot of things going on. But reach out. Reach out. I know I may not have all the answers, but I think it's really important. And if you have questions about things that you want to navigate, you can always contact me at Kind Space, and I can definitely help you navigate. That's what I'm here for. And so, you know, like, get to know my face, and you know, and feel comfortable to come and approach. And I think that that is super important for us as trans people, but as things as really being able, you know, there's conflict in all communities, but really ensuring that we are open to one another and recognizing that that probably every trans person who has ever been trans has experienced hate, has experienced violence, and even if that violence doesn't have to be somebody screaming at you, calling you a pejorative or a discriminatory term. It can be simply a denial of services or a denial of your lived experience and yourself. And you know what? And you know, and I just want to let you know, sorry, I always get emotional with these things. So I just see all the babies who are just like, don't recognize, you're loved, man. You are loved, you are valued, and you're not alone. And I don't know how many times I have to repeat it, but it is so crucial, because there are many times I felt alone and I didn't know that there were resources out there, because it's not always easy to find them. And so if you're on this panel today, that is one way that you can contact us, let us know where to find us, and help you go in the right direction. Sorry, maybe some folks on the panel don't want a direct contact, but I'm here. Because again, it's hard to directly fight that unless we have the infrastructure to do it. And so I think it's up to cis folks in the panel, we have advice for trans people, sure. But that advice, can be a lot better if cis people, step up and, and listen to trans voices and really push through and help push through the rights and the supports and the infrastructure that trans people need. So we don't have to keep having these conversations every 2 years.
Sorry, go ahead, Noah.
No, go ahead.
Okay, I just had something quick, kind of building off and echoing what Jade said. We talked kind of at the top of the panel about how a lot of trans people isolate themselves because it feels safer. But the flip side of that is that it makes what you're experiencing feel like you're the only one who's experiencing it. I've started talking to and hanging out with and following more trans people in like the last 6 months, and my quality of life has gotten so exponentially better. And I think like it can be really daunting to try and find community, but I do just want to shout out the work Kindspace does, because I think they're amazing. But like join Kindspace's Discord servers, or like go to trans events or go to queer events, because I think if you're the only trans person surrounded by cis people, it can feel like no one else knows what you're going through. And that is an incredibly difficult experience. So I think building community of people who look like you and live like you is super important.
Agreed. And just want to echo everything Jade and Jaime said, like, you are loved, you're not alone. And as a former service provider who facilitated, support groups during COVID, like, there are lots of folks who are seeking community, who want to make connections, and who are feeling alone. But again, as Jade mentioned, like and I think Jaime as well, like as a service provider in the city, there are tons of trans folks here, and I think that's reflective in terms of the way in which trans folks navigate services and the wait times, et cetera. It's not because there's like 5 trans people here. It's because there's a lot of us here, and there's not enough resources to match how much of us are in this city and are existing, right? And so that's what I want to say. And for folks experiencing violence, I also want to say, like, continue to be creative around how you look at safety for yourself and how you address it and go through violence, right? I know that's something that I had to do, is just like be very creative with my thinking when I leave the house, and be really intentional about planning and safety and what that looks like. And I think something else that I want to mention, and this is sort of inspired by Alok Menon, who's like a really prominent trans person of color, is that oftentimes when folks are, projecting hate, spewing hate, they hate themselves, or they have something going on internally. And to those folks, I want to say that, you can be free too. As trans folks, I'm of the opinion that we are some of the freest human beings on this earth, because we are living in our authentic selves, right? And you can do that too. And I'm of the opinion that like cis folks don't get to do it like us. Like, we get to choose our name. We get to choose our name. We get to live as our fullest selves. And like, that's lit, that's joy, that's power to me, despite the hate that you're spewing, despite how you think, despite what your uncle is saying, despite these systems and these institutions that are saying otherwise, despite the folks that are ignoring, there is real power and there's real joy in being trans and gender diverse. And I know that, you know, and I think about this in the context of being a Black person as well, and how my history has been erased and what gender diversity looked like ancestrally for my people. And now this narrative of, you know, this is what it looks like, or this is how it's seen to be trans. And it's not that, despite what folks are saying. So, you know, it's not easy, and I'm not recommending to throw that hate back at them. But just know that, you know, like folks are going through things that you don't know about, and, you know, they're personally attacking you, but it's probably a projection because they're going through something. And you know what, at cis folks, you know, if you're having feelings questioning your gender, that's okay. If you're having feelings questioning your sexuality, that's okay. We had the room, and despite how hard it was, despite the hate and the safety issues, we have the room to live with our authentic selves. And, you know, as human beings, like I mentioned earlier, you have the room to live as your authentic self as well. And that is not in conflict with trans folks. And that's what I want to say.
I want to add two things too. I feel like a lot of times when there's like discussions around this point, there's like a pressure for people to get over it. And it's like, no, it hurts and it's okay. And you're allowed to feel that and take as long as it takes with that. It's easier to not force yourself to get over anything. Just take as long as it needs. And for older trans people, and non-binary people, every year there's a new generation of people who have been traumatized, and they're young and they haven't had the skills yet to deal with all of this negativity that they've just started to be liberated from. And so for us older folk, I'm like, be there for them. Look beyond any unideal way that they might be communicating for what's behind it, and just be there.
Oh, I feel like I just like want to put everybody in a room, like bring out some tea and coffee and just like let this continue. But that is indeed not the case. And so we are, as many of you may have noted, coming near to our close. We do have a statement that I would like to read in a moment, but before I do so, I want to thank our panelists. I love the magic that happens when you take brilliant people and put them in a room together. I also love the magic that happens when they build off of one another and share insights and advice that to me is deeply powerful, and indeed to me is something that can inform a way forward, a way to create safety and justice, health and liberation for our communities. And for that, I cannot, there is no words that can convey the degree of thanks that I feel this evening. My thought on safety is what works for you works for you. If it is crying on your partner's shoulder, it is crying on your partner's shoulder. If it's telling yourself that you're not the person who's ever going to go to that focus group and that peer group because, you know, you're doing all right. Like you can go to that peer group if you need to go to that peer group, and it's okay if you don't. I spent a lot of time doing gay things, and I cannot imagine myself in like a drop-in program. Like I'm just not that kind of person. When I need something, I cry on my partner's shoulder. Nobody sees it, and that's just how it is. Find that person or find that space that works for you. As we come to a close, however, I do want to spend a moment talking about our city. A city that talks so much about its inclusivity and how diverse it is and how wonderful it is. And yet many of us, and myself included, have tried to get our mayor to denounce anti-trans hate time and time again, and he hasn't. Our mayor has, who is a gay man himself, has had slurs hurled at him and has indeed struggled with homophobia as the person he is not denouncing violence against trans people in this city. Our council has not denounced the stickers that are popping up across this city. And I think I'm gonna, come back to that in a moment, but I also want to encourage cis folks on this call to listen to trans communities and trans organizations around both municipal, provincial, and federal calls for justice. There is a big process that I think we have an obligation to go through where we unpack this idea of Canada as oh so inclusive. That is a colonial myth that doesn't translate into safety for many in our communities. And that's not just, or even particular to trans people. That is true for many on this land. And for many of us, this is not indeed our land. Within this and within our time together, we are launching a statement in a few moments that's going live on the OCTEVAW Instagram and across various social media channels. I'm going to read part of it. The statement says that trans, gender diverse, and 2S LGBTQ communities are subjected to significant violence in Ottawa and across Canada. Despite progress on our rights, the everyday realities of many in our communities are largely unchanged. Too many in our communities live precariously, barely able to make ends meet, and many in our communities are houseless, living in poverty, and harassed simply for existing as their authentic selves in public space. Many folks are struggling to survive in a world that continues to be deeply homophobic and transphobic, and all governments have a role to play in advancing safety, security, health, rights, and justice for trans, gender diverse, and 2S LGBTQ people. Our municipalities are the most immediate and direct form of government in our worlds. They have the most immediate and direct impact on our daily lives. While the City of Ottawa has taken steps towards 2S LGBTQ inclusion and liberation, they are still shirking their role and their responsibility towards communities. And so we are calling for 4 things in particular. We are calling on the City of Ottawa and City Council to denounce and unequivocally we are calling upon the City of Ottawa to publicly and unequivocally denounce anti-trans hate, rhetoric, and violence in this community and in this city. We are also calling upon the city to respond to the recommendations identified in Wisdom to Actions report entitled Ottawa 2S LGBTQ Community Service Needs, Gaps, and Recommendations with a clear plan for implementation. We are also calling on the city to designate a 2S LGBTQ secretariat within our municipality to take a leadership role in advanced 2S LGBTQ inclusion, both within the city infrastructure and within our broader community, and to establish a municipal 2S LGBTQ advisory council with community members and representatives from local organizations to inform, guide municipal efforts on 2S LGBTQ health, safety, and inclusion. As we come to a close, I would encourage all folks in this space to go on their social channels and retweet, share, like, or in any way put the word out about this call to action. We have a lot more to do, and we need your help to do it. Noah, Maëlys, Jamie, and Jade, thank you from the bottom of my heart for agreeing to participate today and for all that you do in our community and in this city. I have been near tears a couple times tonight, and I have been feeling warm in my heart on many occasions, and so I thank you for your time. For our audience, thank you for making this a priority. To the organizations that help make this event happen, thank you for helping make this event happen. And to all of you, à tous et à tous, bonsoir, merci beaucoup, et onwards and upwards. Good night, everybody.
I can start the dance party music.
Right. Debbie, I think we have to look to you to end the meeting.